The Leap must begin by respecting inherent rights and title of the original caretakers of this land, starting by fully implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So when I was asked to chair Raven, I said, I don't know anything about this. I grew up in Southeast Asia, I have no clue. Why are you asking me? And they said, because you're good at governance. I went, oh, you know. But what is it? The reason I wanted to speak to you all about it is that I have made a faux pas a day ever since I started. Ever since. Because I'm on such a high learning curve to rearrange my head, my heart, and my psyche and reframe my perception of my interaction with Indigenous people and where we all fit in the magic that is Canada. And I wanted to put that on the table because I don't think we can leap unless we're going to the level of discomfort. And I promise you, I have felt like a right idiot about something I should have known at least once a day since I started 3 years ago. And I'm kind of still keep stumbling, and I'm proud of it. Because it's also an act of reconciliation, and reconciliation is not always, you know, hearts and flowers like this idealized version. Sometimes it's sitting down with somebody that you don't understand and duking it out with them until you do both understand each other. And it's not always pretty. And so I sort of wanted to make a pitch for us leaping into areas, realms that we don't know, we don't understand, and we're not comfortable with.
It says in so many words that the only way to stop the environmental degradation of the planet is to end corporate control of state policy. And to that end, it calls for removing corporate money from political campaigns, for ending trade deals which give free rein to multinational corporations to block and subvert environmental regulations, and it calls for the Canadian government to accept the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights, giving the First Nations more power to resist corporate encroachment on their territories. In weaving together these environmental and social demands, the manifesto has much in common with the eco-socialist wing of the environmental movement. And that's not surprising, of course, given the influence of social democrats like Naomi Klein and Avi Lewis, who are its most well-known proponents. Unfortunately, their celebrity status sometimes obscures the fact that the manifesto equally reflects the interests of a broad range of social organizations. In fact, the manifesto was launched by nearly 36 of them, primarily drawn from the Indigenous trade union and environmental movements at a 2-day conference in Toronto last year. Among the groups were the Canadian Union of Postal Workers and the Council of Canadians, who we're fortunate to have represented here on our panel tonight. Now, it's true that for the present, the Leap Manifesto is only a common front of social organizations on paper. But it does provide a programmatic framework and the prospect of greater cooperation between these organizations on the ground going forward. The challenge, of course, we're presented with is to translate this common front on paper into a common front in practice, which is essentially why we formed Leap Victoria several months ago. We believe that unless the manifesto gives rise to a network of local groups across the country, groups which regularly organize events like this one, it risks becoming just another fading document with no lasting impact. Fortunately, there seems to be a strong base of public support on which to build this network. You'll recall the widespread media attention which the manifesto received when it was debated at the NDP convention last April. An ECOS poll shortly thereafter showed that not only had most Canadians heard of the manifesto, but that a majority outside the orbit of the Conservative Party supported it. And since then, the manifesto has been signed online by tens of thousands of Canadians, including many public figures identified with the environmental movement, such as Marvin, David Suzuki, Donald Sutherland, and others. And if you're interested, you can add your name to the manifesto, and of course we'd encourage you to do so at leapmanifesto.org. I think we need to emphasize several points. First and most obviously, that the oil price is not going to return to these levels, that the fossil fuel industry is in irreversible decline, and that jobs are going to continue to disappear in oil and gas while they rapidly increase in wind, solar, and other renewables. The latest report of the International Renewable Energy Agency, for example, shows that employment in the green energy sector grew by 5% to 8 million worldwide last year, while oil and gas shed 250,000 jobs. Second, it's not only the environmental movement, people like us who are making these claims. The global elites are also forecasting the demise of the fossil fuel industry. I'm thinking in particular of central bankers like Mark Carney, oil industry leaders themselves, like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and many other energy experts and investors. They're warning that most of the assets currently held as reserves will remain stranded in the ground. The elites may be less concerned about global warming than that these stranded assets will ultimately bankrupt the highly indebted oil and gas industry and threaten the stability of the global financial system. But whatever their motives, they're adding to the pressure to direct investment away from fossil fuels and towards renewables. Third, it follows from this that the only realistic course is to retrain oil and gas workers to take up jobs in the emerging green economy. That's the position advanced by the Leap Manifesto. It's also the position, incidentally, of a progressive group of trade unionists within the industry called Iron and Earth, which some of you may have heard of. They argue that oil and gas workers are uniquely qualified to make the transition to the new green jobs, and they're pushing to accelerate rather than slow down the pace of conversion. Fourth, we have to weigh the lost jobs in the oil patch against the many more we're foregoing by not investing in the much larger low carbon sectors of the economy. The Leap Manifesto rightly points out that there are enormous job creation opportunities to be had in the expansion of healthcare, education, and many other socially necessary services. One major low-carbon initiative along these lines is a plan to convert the vast network of post offices into renewable energy hubs and community-based green investment banks. It was developed jointly by CUPW and supporters of the Leap Manifesto, and I'm sure Janet Barney, who is here with us tonight and who's from the union, will have more to say on that shortly. This brings us finally to the question of cost, of affordability. This troubles those Canadian taxpayers, as you know, who are most susceptible to corporate propaganda that public spending is too costly and wasteful, especially on the scale envisaged by the Leap Manifesto. They need to be persuaded that government spending is preeminently political rather than an economic issue. And here the manifesto provides a very useful link to a study by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. It shows that just restoring taxes on corporations to what they were 15 years ago will more than cover the cost of moving swiftly to a green economy. Concretely, this would mean ending fossil fuel subsidies, imposing financial transaction taxes, increasing resource royalties, as well as sharp cuts in military spending and other bold measures. I'd like to conclude by suggesting that history is moving in our direction, but whether we'll succeed in averting catastrophic climate change before we run out of time is, of course, the great existential question of our age. Initiatives like the Leap Manifesto and the supporters it has engendered in such a short period of time does give me confidence that, that we can make a difference. And on that helpful note, I'll pass the mic to Jessica at our panel.
First of all, thank you all for coming on a rainy evening. Thank Leap Victoria for organizing this, and thank the COC Victoria for being here. I don't feel like I'm an expert. I'm from the 60s where the saying was leap and the net will appear. So I thought, okay, I can do this. We know that the Conservatives are in bed with the oil companies who are in bed with the banks. We know that the Liberals are in bed with the banks who are in bed with the oil companies. The NDP sleeps around, and, and the Greens really don't know who they're sleeping with. If anybody wants to talk to me on that, they can after. So we're disconnected as well from scientific evidence, and where we used to listen to the canaries, we now have become the frogs in boiling water. See, Council of Canadian has 56 chapters. 27 of the chapters across Canada have screened the film, This Changes Everything, and a total audience of over 4,000 people, with Peterborough having moved forward initiating a LEAP chapter. And I think I'm just going to repeat it because this is part of the Council of Canadians too. We support, there's 4 things that we demand. LEAP must begin by respecting the inherent rights and title of original caretakers of this land, starting by fully implementing the United Nations declarations on the right of Indigenous people. 2, the latest research shows that we could get 100% of our electricity from renewable resources within the next 2 decades. By 2050, we could have 100% clean economy. And we demand this shift now. Let's leap. No infrastructure projects that lock us into increased extraction decades into the future. The new iron law of energy development must be, if you don't want it in your backyard, then it doesn't belong in anybody's backyard. 4, we want training and resources for workers in carbon-intensive jobs, ensuring that they are fully able to participate in the clean energy economy. The COC calls for an end to all trade deals that interfere with our attempts to rebuild local economies, regulate corporations, and to stop damaging extractive projects. Trade deals have been one of our many focuses, and we continue to work for public health versus private profit. COC has long opposed the ISDS. I hate acronyms. I've got learning disabilities, and people just rail them off and you really don't know what they're talking about. So it's the Investor-State Dispute Settlement. Right. The poster child of the ISDS is the Lone Pine Resources, who only want $250 million under the NAFTA lawsuit filed against Canada. This was filed, it's still ongoing, in 2012, because the Quebec provincial government issued a moratorium against fracking. So if Canada settles and pays before the ISDS arbitration commences, or if Canada loses the case, which we have lost many cases, the stats was, of the 3 parties in NAFTA, Canada has suffered the most under the ISDS. 35 claims have cost over $200 million in damages and fees. We're still paying. And what we don't know what we're paying is probably a lot more. This is what we've had to do. So if we lose this case, it will crack the world open to fracking it out. The Leap Manifesto is important as it addresses that fossil economy has produced wild inequalities that have left much of the world behind, while conferring the privileges of energy along unfair and wholly undesirable racial, national, gender, and class lines. Leaping may depend less on finding new, less ecological and destructive forms of energy than on restructuring and curbing what looks to be like a limitless desire provoked and fueled by consumerism. We need to change how we think, imagine, see, hear, as oil shapes our ideas and values as much as it does our infrastructure and economics. An international energy transaction will require us to think new about wealth, beauty, community success, and a host of other ideas that form our societies and ourselves. We need to recognize that we live in an addictive society, and we are all addicted to oil. We need help. I think Leap can do that.
So it's my sad task to address the part of the Leap Manifesto which says that we have hardly any time left to leap and save our planet, save ourselves from global climate catastrophe. Okay. So in 1 year, the scientists have been absolutely stunned by what's happening with regards to what is actually atmospheric greenhouse gas pollutions. See, all of these graphs going up, in actual fact, represent unprecedented deterioration in the state of the planet. We have a rapidly deteriorating ocean acid-base chemistry. We are altering the chemistry of the atmosphere of the oceans at a rate which has never happened before. It's insane. It's literally crazy and criminally crazy. We have rapidly deteriorating, as I say, atmospheric CO2 levels. CO2 going up means the planet's going down, and obviously the global temperature. The global temperature is going up, the planet is going down. So that's a different perspective that I hope and I'm sure that you'll appreciate. So, the National Post. Yes, but the National Post on their front page has the new war against pipelines. Front page. Okay? This, of course, is the how a tiny camp at Standing Rock is growing into a global movement. Yes! The good news, of course, is the fantastic progress, which again I never imagined on the good side. The fantastic progress which is being made by clean energy, renewable energy, all over the world. The latest good news on that, which was just published, I think, a couple of days ago by the Bloomberg Business News, is that for the first time, last year, I guess, there was more renewable energy investment. That's been the same way for a couple of years, but more renewable energy development than fossil fuel development, right? But we have to have no fossil fuels, okay? The science is definite. The AR5 was absolutely definite. We have to get emissions down substantially in the next few decades.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here on the unceded territories of the Lekwungen and the Coast Salish people. I am past chief. I'm not sure if we got that, but no longer chief. You know, it is a big war that is being waged against us. And the more voices that we have, the better it's going to be. But many of our politicians can't hear. And it was exciting last week to see the Inuit and Innu youth in Ottawa protesting the Nalcor Dam. And, you know, they all, well, 99 of them got arrested. So it's good to see our young people stepping up to the plate, because it's their future, it's their world that we're actually affecting right now. A couple of people tonight have already mentioned that the Leap Manifesto talks about the respecting the inherent rights and title of the original caretakers of this land. The Constitution of Canada, which is Canada's laws, recognizes and affirms the rights and title of First Nations in this country. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court of Canada has said that these rights can be infringed upon. They keep on infringing and infringing and infringing, and what's going to be left? And the court said that they can do it if it's for the benefit of the greater Canadian society. And the governments always think that money and jobs, the revenue flowing to them, is more important than First Nations rights. So Section 35 has not been the answer to the protection of First Nations rights. It feels like we spend our whole time and effort fighting things like Site C, like Kinder Morgan, like Enbridge, like Pacific Northwest LNG, like Raven Coal, like all of those big projects that are being mounted against us. And instead of ourselves doing sustainable development and putting our time and energy into that, we spend a lot of time having to fight the bigger battles because it's going to affect the drinking water for all of us. It's going to affect the land. And, you know, the Leap Manifesto says that we need to implement the Universal Declaration of Indigenous Rights. And I want to stress to you that that's a minimum standard. UNDRIP, as we call it, is a UN document. There wasn't one First Nation that got to vote on UNDRIP. It was passed by states. It was compromised from what Indigenous peoples around the world wanted. It's not strong enough. But it's there, it's a minimum standard, and it's a good place to start. I think the most important part of UNDRIP is free, prior, and informed consent. That before anything happens in our territory, to our lands, our waters, our resources, our consent has to be given. Trudeau campaigned, I'm going to implement UNDRIP. And yes, we're going to allow First Nations to say no. It lasted till the day he was elected. You know, now he's saying no doesn't mean a veto. What does no mean? Does no mean no? No, not in his mind. And not in the mind of Jody Wilson-Raybould, who is the Attorney General of Canada. You know, as a First Nations person, she has to go against everything she's ever believed in to be in that position. And I feel sorry for her because she's had to go up against First Nations and the rights that she fought so hard for. You know, many of the projects are going to affect our way of life. You know, going out on the land, being able to, you know, collect cedar bark or medicinal plants or fish and hunt. And that's why we fight so hard against these things, is because it is going to affect, you know, the way we live. And it's something that we will continue to do. We look forward to having our future generations also being able to exercise our rights, that they'll be able to go into the Somas River where I'm from and fish sockeye and coho, chinook, all of those wonderful fish that come up there. But, you know, they may not. They may be looking at pictures and say, oh yeah, this is what my grandparents used to do. When they put in the Pacific Northwest LNG, that's going to warm up the oceans even further than what you mentioned. And, you know, our Chinook come from Alaska. They swim right past there, down the coast, up the Alberta Inlet, and they spawn in our territory. And that's what we don't want to see happen. And I think we're willing to do a whole lot of things. One of the other mentions in the Leap Manifesto again is renewable energy, a commitment to 100% renewable energy. In British Columbia, we do have what is considered clean energy of about 93%. But what the government is proposing and is building right now is Site C, a mega dam that's going to come online by 2024, 1,100 megawatts of power. And what are they doing to get clean energy They're destroying the environment. They're destroying the land, agricultural land. They're inundating burial sites and sacred sites with water. And we're supposed to think that this is a good thing in 2016. But the biggest, I think, the biggest thing that issue with Site C is that the government doesn't want anyone to build any of these small run-of-the-river projects anymore. They don't want us to be building solar. They don't want us to be building geothermal unless we're just feeding our own homes and our own buildings. We can no longer sell that power to BC Hydro. When they announced Site C, they took out all clean energy projects, and First Nations and Clean Energy BC stood up and said, no, you can't do that. So we got them to put a program in place for 45 megawatts a year. And that's not very many. You know, you could have 3 50 megawatt projects, you could have a bit more. And now, because they need to do rate cuts in BC Hydro because of the BCUC rate review, they're going to cut us back between 2020 and 2024 to one project a year, basically. It'll be 15 megawatts because they have to take $65 million out of the program. So where are we going to be in creating clean energy as the world becomes 100% renewable or works towards that? With all the new technology, the world is going to leap ahead of us. And in BC, we're not going to have the ability to do that. Many First Nations have embraced clean energy. 125 have some kind of involvement in a clean energy project, whether that's just revenue sharing, being owners, co-owners, and that's a lot. 125 out of 203 First Nations, and there are many that want to do more. Here on the South Island, Soup wanted to enter into a wind project with Island Timberlands for 300 megawatts, and it was billions of dollars. But they have no one to sell it to because BC Hydro won't buy it. There are many First Nations across the province that want to do that. And while their Site C is going to create too much power, you know, it's the destruction of what they're doing. But, you know, the Liberals deliberately made this decision knowing that First Nations would not be able to create clean energy. And that's the sad part of all of this, is that they went against what was in the Clean Energy Act. They went against the promises they made to First Nations. They created a clean energy business fund to give money to First Nations so they could do clean energy, and they're still giving money out under it, even though you do all your feasibility work and you can't sell it to BC Hydro. It's a real shame. And in my community, we built a run-of-the-river project way back, and we turned on the switch in 2005. So we've been operating for quite a while. And the kind of income it brings to our community, once we pay off all our debt, is going to be 1.5 times what we get from the Department of Indian Affairs. One small project. And so I've been involved in the clean energy industry since 2002, and really believe in what we can do. And I'm working with a lot of First Nations who are pushing for clean energy. I work with a lot of First Nations that are pushing their own economic agenda and trying to keep out all those other places. So, as First Nations, people are taking a stand and trying to do what's right for the territory. But court cases, the National Energy Board, Joint Review Panels are approving these projects. Pacific Northwest LNG is going to create all those greenhouse gases. And Canada says, oh, we can do it, but let's put some conditions on it. But it still doesn't do anything. We're still in trouble. And with all these international agreements, that's another part of this. My sister Brenda has worked really hard against FIPA and the TPP, and today they signed CETA over in Europe. And all of these free trade agreements, all they're doing is feeding the corporate agenda, creating more development, creating more greenhouse gases, consuming all of our resources from our territories. And there's so many issues that we have to address as people, and it's great to see that different groups are taking on different issues, trying to support each other when we can. but it's really costly. So it's great we have people like Raven that can help raise money, crowdfunding sites, different places like that as First Nations try and embark and fight what's going on in our territories. We can't do it alone. But certainly, as we add more and more voices, as we're seeing at the Dakota pipeline, when you see that kind of movement, you just want to join, and you just got to do it. And so, you know, we do really have to make a leap. You know, a while back ago, David Suzuki was saying we had to do it within a generation. Now we're past that generation. You know, we waited too long, and you know, we just have to do what we can as individuals and as a collective, and move forward against these governments that don't want to hear us. We have to find ways to make them. Clay ko for your time.
And I've been with the Post Office, Canada Post, 29 years, 12 years, the most recent 12 years delivering mail and out in the West Shore, Langford. And some consider the Post Office past its prime. In the last decade under Harper has seen efforts to cut it, devalue it, and undermine this public service. Just imagine, if you would, Canada Post buildings with charging stations for electric vehicles at post offices, a renewable powered postal fleet that connects farms to dinner tables, door-to-door mail carriers checking in on seniors and people with mobility issues, as well as delivering locally produced food and other services. Post offices as community hubs for social innovation, connecting climate-friendly businesses to customers. And also postal banking services that provide small towns and Indigenous communities with inclusive financial services like loans to families underserved by the big commercial banks. Now I want to talk about Canada Post's vast infrastructure. I don't know if you realize there's 6,300 post offices across this country. We have more outlets than Tim Hortons. And a lot of these communities, that's the only federal building in their community is a post office. And what would you do if you owned the largest retail outlets in this country? And it's also a large logistical network that can mobilize people and move materials to coast to coast to coast. And we are in the world's second largest country. And you own it. A lot of people forget that it is a public postal service and the Canadian public owns it. And we like to address some of the most pressing challenges, such as climate change, delivering services to an aging population, providing financial services to low-income communities, and using the profits, which the media like to not let anybody know that's a big secret, that Canada Post has been making profits for the last 20 years, and use these profits to help fund other public initiatives. So with this vast infrastructure and delivery network, we have the potential to become the hub of a green and social economy. We could expand door-to-door delivery, because door-to-door delivery reduces the use of fossil fuels that customers driving to pick up their mail. We are totally opposed to the community mailbox for a number of reasons, but one was the energy impact, and the other one is the keeping your jobs in the community. And we also would like to support for elders and those with limited mobility, where mail carriers are already the eyes and the ears of their neighborhoods, could check in on elders and deliver medicines and other services. These are not new ideas. They've been done all around the world. There's proven models. Norway replaced its diesel-powered postal fleet with new electric vehicles. United Kingdom, France, New Zealand, Brazil, and Italy all have successful postal banking services that assist rural, remote, and low-income communities while providing new revenues for the postal service. Japan expanded postal worker service to provide assistance to elders, deliver food, and check in on those with limited mobility. And in France and Australia, they use their postal fleets to deliver fresh and frozen food, connecting farmers and local businesses directly to customers. France has also started a pilot project to provide access to affordable 3D printing through post offices and its postal bank, finances expansion and improvements of social housing. In Swiss Posts, they provide public transportation in rural areas and offers businesses online payment processing. And Australia Post acts as an alternative to PayPal. And Postal provides e-commerce services for businesses. There's a lot of communities in Canada that don't have a bank. A lot of the big banks are pulling out of small communities because they're not profitable enough. They don't want to make some money, they want to make the big money, and so they pull out. There's some communities on the northern tip of the island that don't have banks, and some of even the credit unions are pulling out. So there's in Europe, they have postal banking in a lot of the post offices, such as France, Italy, Switzerland, Japan. We had postal banking in Canada up till 1968. And we still do some, the legislation is still on the books. We still do some financial services, such as money orders and MoneyGrams. So the legislation is not there, or still there, so it's nothing we have to reinvent. It's still there. We just got to get the government to go forward with it. And because they're sleeping with the big banks, it's an uphill battle. But postal banking is simple. Post offices could provide everyday financial services like checking and savings accounts and loans and insurance. Canada's major banks raked in $35 billion in 2015. And this is a public service that you own. We'd like to have a piece of that pie so we could take that money and put it into other things. And there's hundreds of thousands of Canadians that don't have a bank account at all. And there's only 54 of the 615 First Nation communities that are served by a local branch. That's only 54. It's a very low number. And about 2 million people a year in Canada use payday lenders. And we all know they charge interest rates of up to 400%. It's ludicrous. So, and every year, workers in Canada transfer billions of dollars in remittance to family members overseas, and the cost is up to 20%. So that's a huge burden for them to transfer money. So once again, I'd just like to highlight that we want to be building on Canada's next economy with green jobs, purchasing Canadian-made electric cars and vans, electric vehicle infrastructure, turning post offices into charging stations, and pursuing community elder care, and having seniors in your own, having that independence to stay in their own house, financing communities in clean energy, local food deliveries, delivering fresh produce in our community, and supporting local businesses. And thank you for coming to this local event, and thank you for having me. Thank you.